The old library wall made no sound until a German shepherd refused to leave it alone. A steel door groans somewhere behind the bookshelves as Ethan freezes, the cold iron key digging into his palm. Ranger lets out one low growl, then presses his nose against the oak panel again. Dust drifts through a beam of fading light, and neither of them knows who sealed this place, or why it was meant to stay hidden for so long. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? The envelope looked too clean to belong in Ethan Mercer's truck. It rested on the cracked vinyl seat beside a faded road atlas, an empty thermos, and a pair of worn leather gloves whose fingertips had long ago molded themselves to his hands. Outside, October wind carried dry leaves across the gravel parking lot of a roadside rest area somewhere in western Montana. A row of cottonwoods shivered under a gray sky, while 18-wheelers rumbled along the interstate beyond the trees. Ranger lifted his head from the blanket spread across the truck's floorboard. The old German shepherd's ears twitched once. He watched Ethan without making a sound. "You think it's another bill?" Ethan asked quietly. The dog blinked. That was answer enough. For nearly 6 years, most official-looking envelopes had carried bad news. Medical collections, insurance disputes, notices reminding him of debts he could never repay. Ethan had learned not to rush opening them. Bad news never spoiled if it waited another hour. He reached for the envelope anyway. The return address belonged to a law office in Missoula. Inside lay a single folded letter. "Mr. Ethan Mercer, please contact our office regarding the estate of Mr. Charles Alden Whitaker. Your presence is requested at your earliest convenience." There was a phone number beneath the signature. No explanation, no details. Ethan stared through the windshield for a long time. Charles Whitaker. The name tugged faintly at a memory buried beneath years of harder ones. An old man, a fishing hat, a laugh that always arrived before the joke. He hadn't thought about Charles in over 20 years, back before Iraq, before Afghanistan, before hospital rooms smelled more familiar than home, back when life still moved forward. Ranger nudged Ethan's elbow. The veteran folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "I guess we're driving to Missoula." The dog stood immediately. His tail gave one slow sweep against the truck seat. The law office occupied the second floor of a brick building overlooking the Clark Fork River. Everything inside smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee. Ethan paused near the entrance, unconsciously surveying the room before taking another step. Reception desk, 2 exits, windows facing the street, one elderly couple, no obvious threats. His mind completed the assessment before he realized he was doing it. Old habits, habits that never retired. A young receptionist smiled warmly. "Mr. Mercer?" He nodded. "Mr. Holbrook is expecting you." The attorney was older than Ethan expected. Silver hair, dark suit, kind eyes that seemed accustomed to difficult conversations. He stood to shake Ethan's hand. And this must be Ranger. The dog sat quietly beside Ethan without being told. "He usually introduces himself," Ethan said. "Perhaps he already has." The attorney smiled before opening a weathered folder. "I'm sorry for calling you in without explanation. I figured somebody finally found another debt." Mr. Holbrook shook his head. "No." He slid a faded photograph across the desk. The image showed an older man standing beside a massive stone house surrounded by towering pines. Charles Whitaker. Instantly the memory returned. 23 years earlier. Fort Harrison Veterans Hospital. Ethan had been recovering from a shattered knee after his first deployment. Charles had volunteered there every Thursday. Not a doctor, not family. Just a widower who sat beside veterans nobody came to visit. Sometimes they played checkers, sometimes they watched baseball, sometimes they simply sat without speaking. Charles never asked about combat, never offered advice. He only treated every young soldier like someone worth knowing. Ethan had left the hospital, Life had happened. The visits stopped. I haven't seen him since, Ethan whispered. The spring of 2001, the attorney finished. He remembered. Ethan frowned. I don't understand. Mr. Whitaker passed away last month. Silence settled over the office. He left very little in terms of cash. The attorney turned another page. But he left you his residence. Ethan looked up. I'm sorry. The property is yours. He slid a deed across the desk. Stone Manor, Black Pine Ridge, nearly 160 acres, Northern Rockies. Ethan stared at the document without speaking. There must be a mistake. There isn't. I wasn't family. No, he hardly knew me. The attorney folded his hands. He believed otherwise. Another envelope appeared. He wrote instructions. The paper had yellowed slightly. Mr. Mercer, if you're reading this, then I was right about one thing. You survived. People often inherit what they ask for. I'm leaving my home to someone who never asked me for anything. Take care of it if you can. If you cannot, at least give it one honest look before deciding. Charles Ethan read it twice, then a third time. His throat tightened unexpectedly. No one had trusted him with anything in years. Not a company, not a bank, not even most landlords. Now someone had handed him an entire mountain estate. The attorney quietly placed an old iron key onto the desk. Rust marked every groove. The house has been empty for decades, so I've inherited a ruin, according to most people. A second folder appeared. Several typed letters, photographs, newspaper clippings. The attorney hesitated. Mr. Whitaker's nieces and nephews were disappointed. He chose the word carefully. They believed the manor should have remained in the family. They didn't contest it. They inspected it once. He allowed himself a small smile. They called it a money pit. Another clipping showed local headlines. Abandoned manor deteriorates again. A handwritten note had been clipped beside it. Good luck selling that place. They're happy to let you have it, Mr. Halbrook said quietly. They're convinced it'll bankrupt whoever owns it. Ethan looked again at the photograph. The manor stood proud despite broken windows, massive stone chimneys, steep slate roof, dark forest behind it. Even abandoned, it looked stubborn, like it had simply decided to outlast everyone. You'll need supplies. I've lived out of a pickup. I don't need much. The attorney studied him for a long moment. You served overseas? Ethan nodded. Iraq first, then Afghanistan. I was with the Rangers. The older man simply nodded. My son served. Nothing more needed saying. Military men often left sentences unfinished. They understood the parts words couldn't carry. The paperwork took another hour. When everything was signed, the attorney walked Ethan downstairs. Outside, afternoon sunlight broke briefly through the clouds. Ranger waited patiently beside the truck. The dog stood as Ethan approached. His nose brushed Ethan's hand before he looked toward the mountains rising faintly on the northern horizon, almost as though he already knew where they were going. Ethan unlocked the truck. He turned the iron key over once in his palm. Cold, heavy, older than both of them, he slipped it carefully into his pocket. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't driving toward another temporary job, or another campground, or another parking lot where no one noticed an old veteran sleeping in his truck. Somewhere beyond those mountains had left him a home, whether it deserved saving, or whether it would destroy what little remained of him. He couldn't yet know. Ranger climbed into the passenger seat without hesitation. Ethan started the engine. The truck pulled slowly onto the highway heading north. Neither man nor dog looked back. For the first 100 miles, the landscape changed so gradually, it almost escaped notice. Dry grasslands gave way to thicker stands of pine. Rivers narrowed into cold mountain streams, and distant blue ridges slowly rose until they swallowed the horizon. Ethan drove with both hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, his eyes moving almost constantly between the road ahead, the mirrors, and the tree line beyond the shoulder. It wasn't nervousness. It was habit. Years after leaving the army, his mind still divided every stretch of road into sectors without asking permission. Dead ground, high ground, possible observation points, possible ambush sites. Every bridge received a second glance. Every abandoned vehicle earned another. The war had ended. His body simply hadn't received the message. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, watching the road with the same quiet attention. Every so often he lifted his nose toward the open window, catching scents carried down from the mountains. "You smell it already?" Ethan murmured. The dog's ears tilted forward. The northern Rockies appeared just before sunset. Massive walls of granite climbed into low clouds, while endless forests covered every valley between them. The highway narrowed into a state road before becoming a two-lane mountain route that twisted alongside a rushing river whose water flashed silver beneath the fading light. Cell service disappeared. Radio stations dissolved into static. Silence settled inside the truck. It felt strangely familiar. Near dusk, Ethan turned onto a weathered logging road marked only by a leaning wooden sign that read, "Black Pine Ridge." The gravel road climbed steadily. Loose stones snapped beneath the truck's tires, branches brushed both mirrors. Ranger rose onto all fours. He wasn't excited. He was alert, very alert. Ethan noticed immediately. "You've got something." The dog stared through the windshield without moving. Another mile, then another. Finally, the trees opened. The manor stood alone above a broad meadow surrounded by towering lodgepole pines. Even in decay, it possessed a kind of stubborn dignity. Gray stone walls caught the last light of evening. Two enormous chimneys rose above a slate roof that sagged near its western end. Broken shutters hung crooked from tall windows. A wraparound porch leaned slightly where years of heavy snow had twisted its supports. Nature had tried to reclaim the place. The house simply refused to surrender. Ethan parked nearly 70 yards away, not because he feared the building, because open distance gave better visibility. Without thinking, he chose a position where the truck faced downhill. Easy departure, old instinct. He shut off the engine. Silence flooded in. No traffic, no distant aircraft, only wind passing through pine needles. Ranger waited. He never jumped out until Ethan gave permission. "Go ahead." The German shepherd landed softly on the gravel. Instead of exploring the meadow like most dogs would have, Ranger stopped. His head turned slowly toward the west wing. He sniffed once, then began walking, straight toward the house. Ethan grabbed his backpack and followed. The front steps groaned beneath his boots. The iron key slid into the ancient lock with surprising ease. It resisted once, twice, then turned. A heavy click echoed somewhere deep inside the stone walls. The front door opened inward. Cold air rolled out carrying scents untouched for decades. Dust, old wood, stone, faint traces of smoke trapped inside ancient fireplaces. Nothing else. No mildew strong enough to suggest recent leaks. No fresh footprints. No human scent. The entrance hall stretched farther than Ethan expected. A broad staircase climbed toward the second floor beneath a stained glass window clouded by dirt. Long hallways disappeared into darkness on either side. He remained motionless, listening. Combat had taught him something civilians rarely understood. Every building had its own sound. You entered quietly, then waited. The building introduced itself. Timbers settled, loose shutters tapped, wind found forgotten cracks. Only after learning those sounds could you recognize the wrong one. Nothing moved. Satisfied, Ethan stepped inside. Ranger entered beside him. Immediately, the dog ignored the grand staircase, ignored the dining room, ignored the kitchen passage. He walked calmly down the western hallway. His pace never changed. "Easier, buddy." The dog didn't stop. He disappeared through a wide doorway. Ethan followed. The room beyond had once been magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling oak shelves lined 3 walls. Thousands of books still occupied them beneath thick layers of dust. Tall windows overlooked an overgrown garden where dead vines climbed broken stone walls. At the room's center stood a massive reading table scarred by decades of neglect. A marble fireplace dominated the far wall. Ranger crossed directly to the western bookcases. He stood there, completely still. His nose hovered inches above the wood. Then he looked back at Ethan. No bark, no growl, only expectation. Ethan frowned. "What is it?" The dog sniffed again before sitting quietly. After nearly a minute, he stood, circled once, and left the room without another glance. Ethan examined the shelves. Old books, dust, spiderwebs, nothing unusual. He tapped one shelf absent-mindedly. Solid oak, nothing more. Eventually he shrugged. "Guess you've got better ears than me." Outside, darkness settled quickly. The generator listed in the property inventory hadn't worked in years. Electricity had long since been disconnected. Ethan carried 2 old oil lanterns inside from the truck. By full nightfall, warm yellow light pushed back only small circles of darkness, while the rest of the manor remained hidden beyond shadow. He chose a downstairs room near the entrance rather than one of the bedrooms upstairs. One door, one window, one fireplace, easy to secure. Years overseas had taught him never to sleep above ground level if another choice existed. He spread his sleeping bag near the hearth. Ranger curled beside the door. The fire burned low. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a long, whispering sound. For nearly an hour, Ethan simply watched the flames. His breathing finally slowed. Maybe, just maybe, this place could become something. A sharp crack exploded somewhere overhead. Ethan was on his feet before he consciously moved. His hand grabbed empty air where his rifle would once have hung. His body pivoted automatically toward the doorway, heart pounding, eyes scanning. Another sound, wood shifting inside old rafters, nothing more. He forced himself to breathe. The manor settled again. Ranger remained lying calmly beside the door. The dog looked at Ethan, but never stood. That alone was enough. If Ranger wasn't alarmed, neither should he be. Ethan lowered himself slowly back onto the sleeping bag. His pulse took much longer to obey. Sleep finally arrived sometime after midnight. It didn't last. A distant rumble rolled across the mountains. In his dream, it became collapsing concrete, dust, shouting, someone yelling for a medic. The ceiling disappeared beneath smoke. Ethan jerked awake, already rolling behind the stone fireplace before his eyes fully opened. His shoulder struck cold masonry. His breathing came fast. The room remained dark except for dying embers. No explosions, no radios, no incoming fire. Only rain beginning against the old slate roof. Ranger stood beside him. The dog quietly pressed his head against Ethan's chest until the shaking slowed. "I'm home," Ethan whispered into the darkness, though the words sounded uncertain. Rain continued through the remaining hours before dawn, somewhere inside the vast sleeping manor. A floorboard creaked, then another. Ethan listened. Ranger lifted his head. Both of them turned instinctively toward the western hallway, toward the library. The sound never came again. Ethan remained still for nearly a minute, listening the way he once had outside mud brick compounds under moonless Afghan skies. Rain tapped steadily against the slate roof. Wind sighed through towering pines. Somewhere deep inside the manor, old timber adjusted to colder air with a slow groan that no longer sounded threatening. He finally exhaled. Just the house talking. Ranger relaxed, though he continued staring down the dark hallway another few seconds before returning to the fire. Neither of them slept much after that. Morning arrived quietly. Mist floated across the meadow beyond the front porch while sunlight filtered through towering pines in long golden beams. The mountains looked closer than they had the evening before, their granite faces streaked with fresh snow high above the tree line. Ethan brewed coffee over a camp stove set on the old kitchen range. The first sip tasted smoky, the second tasted like possibility. He unfolded a notebook he had carried since leaving the army. The first page remained blank. He wrote only 5 words. Roof, water, heat, food, safety. That was enough. He wasn't restoring a mansion. He was building a place where winter couldn't kill him. By sunrise, he had already inspected every exterior wall. Years of construction work before his business failed had taught him where buildings usually surrendered first. Loose flashing, cracked mortar, rotten beams. The manor looked neglected, but its bones were remarkable. Stone walls nearly 2 feet thick. Old-growth timber heavier than anything sold today. Whoever built it had expected it to outlive generations. Ranger moved beside him through the property. Unlike the previous day, the dog ignored the library. Instead, he followed Ethan's inspection route, stopping occasionally to sniff around collapsed sheds or brush piles before quietly returning. Near the eastern porch, Ethan climbed an exterior staircase leading toward a second-story balcony. Halfway up, Ranger barked. One sharp command. Ethan froze. The dog planted himself across the stairs. What? Ranger refused to move. Annoyed but curious, Ethan stepped back instead of forward. The old staircase collapsed instantly. Rotten supports snapped beneath their own weight. Broken boards crashed into the weeds below. Dust drifted upward. Ethan stared silently. If Ranger had waited another second, he looked down. The dog simply watched him. Guess you just saved me the hospital trip. Ranger's tail moved once. That afternoon, Ethan began clearing fallen branches from around the house. The work felt good, simple, predictable. Every armload carried away uncovered a little more of the old stone foundation. The rhythm steadied his breathing. Stack, carry, return, repeat. No memories, no nightmares, only work. By late afternoon, he reached an old woodshed leaning against the north wall. Most of its roof had collapsed years earlier. Weathered boards lay scattered beneath waist-high weeds. Ethan slipped on heavy leather gloves before lifting the first plank. Ranger immediately became alert. The dog's nose swept low across the ground. Easier. Ranger circled once, then stepped directly in front of Ethan. Before Ethan could react, a dry, rattling sound broke the silence. Hidden beneath another board lay a large western rattlesnake, its body coiled tightly, its head lifted. The strike came almost instantly. Ranger lunged first. The snake's fangs caught the dog's shoulder instead of Ethan's leg. The German shepherd snapped once. The snake disappeared beneath crushing jaws. Silence returned. Then Ethan saw the blood. No. He dropped beside the dog. 2 puncture wounds darkened Ranger's shoulder, already swelling. Training returned immediately. Pressure, immobilize, stay calm. He searched his memory. The nearest veterinary clinic he'd passed entering the valley had been almost 40 miles back. Too far if he hesitated. Come on, buddy. Ranger tried standing. His front leg trembled. Ethan lifted the 70-pound dog into the truck with surprising ease. Adrenaline ignored age. The old pickup roared down the mountain road faster than it had climbed. Every sharp curve reminded Ethan of convoy routes overseas. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. Stay focused, drive. Nothing else mattered. The small veterinary clinic sat beside a feed store in the nearest mountain town. A woman in her late 50s rushed outside before Ethan even stopped. What happened? Rattlesnake. When? Maybe 30 minutes. Bring him. She moved with calm efficiency. No wasted motion. Inside, Ranger disappeared behind swinging doors. Ethan remained standing exactly where she'd left him, hands empty, unable to help. The waiting room clock ticked louder than it should have. Each second stretched. A young receptionist quietly set a cup of coffee beside him. He didn't notice. Nearly an hour later, the veterinarian returned. He was lucky. Ethan looked up immediately. The bite hit muscle instead of his chest. She smiled gently. Your partner's tough. He always was. We'll keep him overnight. Ethan hesitated. I don't have much money. She studied his worn jacket, the faded Ranger tab stitched above one pocket, the veteran cap resting on his knee. Then she looked through the window toward the truck where military decals had nearly faded away. "We'll figure it out." Those 4 words nearly broke him. People hadn't said that to Ethan in years. Outside, dusk settled across their valley. As Ethan climbed into his truck alone, the passenger seat looked strangely empty. He drove back to the manor without turning on the radio, without speaking, without realizing his right hand reached twice toward the empty seat where Ranger normally rested his head. Darkness had already covered the mountains by the time Ethan returned. He carried only a flashlight inside. The house felt larger now, quieter. Every room echoed differently. He lit the fireplace, made a simple meal he barely touched, then wandered almost unconsciously toward the western hallway. Toward the library, the door stood open. Moonlight spilled across dusty floorboards through tall windows. Ethan leaned one shoulder against the frame. Without Ranger beside him, the room somehow felt unfinished. His eyes drifted toward the same wall where the dog had stopped the day before. Rows of oak shelves, ancient books. Nothing remarkable. Yet something tugged at him, not fear, not curiosity exactly, more like unfinished business. He stepped closer, rested one hand against the wood. The shelf felt colder than the surrounding panels. He frowned. Behind him, the empty manor settled into silence once more. Far away, somewhere beyond the dark mountains, a lone coyote called into the night. Ethan remained standing before the bookshelf for the first time. He wondered whether Ranger had been trying to show him something all along. Ethan left the library only when the dying fire reminded him the house still needed tending. He added another log, checked every door before turning in, and instinctively wedged a chair beneath the front handle. Not because he expected company, but because routines built over decades rarely surrendered. The manor settled around him with slow creaks and sighs. Without Ranger's steady breathing near the hearth, every sound seemed louder. He slept lightly. Just before dawn, headlights swept across the bedroom ceiling. His eyes snapped open. He rolled off the bed before he was fully awake, landing silently beside the window. One hand reached for the flashlight lying exactly where he'd left it. The other instinctively searched for a rifle that had not belonged to him for years. The lights disappeared. No engine, no voices, only darkness. Ethan remained motionless another minute before easing the curtain aside. Nothing. Perhaps a truck had turned around on the distant logging road. Perhaps, he never completely believed, perhaps. By sunrise, he was already outside, following the muddy driveway. Fresh tire tracks stopped nearly 200 yards below the manor before turning back toward the county road. Someone had come. Someone had left. No footprints, no cigarette butts. Nothing carelessly abandoned. He studied the impressions a moment longer before committing their tread pattern to memory. Old habit. Observe. Remember. Move on. The veterinary clinic smelled of antiseptic and cedar shavings. Ranger lifted his head the moment Ethan entered. His tail thumped weakly against the blanket. "There you are." Ethan knelt carefully. The German shepherd pushed his nose against Ethan's shoulder with quiet determination. The veterinarian smiled. "He's sore. I've seen worse." "So has he." She checked the bandage one last time. "The swelling's coming down. Keep him quiet for several days." Ethan almost laughed. Quiet isn't really his personality. He'll try protecting you before himself. "I know." She hesitated before handing Ethan the invoice. Across the balance, someone had written, "Paid." He frowned. "I can't accept." The widowed lady who runs the bakery next door heard what happened. The veterinarian shrugged. She insisted. Ethan stared silently at the paper. Strangers had shown him more kindness in 2 days than he'd received in years. He folded the receipt carefully into his pocket. "Thank you." The rain began shortly after they reached the manor. Not a gentle drizzle, a hard mountain storm. Wind slammed against the stone walls. Tall pines bent until their branches scraped across the slate roof. Inside, Ethan lit lanterns in 3 downstairs rooms before securing every window he could reach. Ranger followed him, despite the stiffness in his shoulder. "You should be resting." The dog ignored him. Lightning flashed. For a heartbeat, the entire manor turned white, then darkness swallowed everything again. Another flash, closer, struck almost instantly. The sound punched through the stone walls. Ethan froze. His coffee cup slipped from his hand. It shattered across the kitchen floor. Another explosion, except it wasn't thunder anymore. It was mortar fire, dust, concrete, a radio screaming over overlapping voices. "Contact! Contact!" Someone shouting coordinates. Another blast. The room disappeared. Without realizing it, Ethan dropped behind the massive stone fireplace in the library. His breathing became short, controlled, automatic. "Move." The command escaped before he knew he'd spoken. "Cover the west wall." There was no squad, no west wall under attack. Only ancient books, rain, darkness. Another flash burst through the tall windows. His shoulders tightened. Every muscle prepared to move, to fight, to survive. Warm fur pressed firmly against his arm. Ranger. The dog had crossed the room despite his injured shoulder, without barking, without panic. He simply leaned against Ethan, solid, present, real. The thunder rolled away into distant mountains. Slowly, the library returned. Bookshelves, fireplace, rain, not Iraq, not Afghanistan, home or something, close enough to become one. Ethan lowered his head. His breathing steadied one careful breath at a time. "I'm sorry, buddy." Ranger rested his chin on Ethan's knee. No judgment, only patience. Minutes passed before Ethan trusted himself to stand. Embarrassment lingered longer than fear. Nobody had witnessed the episode, except the dog, and Ranger had seen worse days than this. The storm continued well into evening. Unable to settle, Ethan began wiping dust from nearby shelves simply to occupy his hands. The repetitive work helped. One shelf, then another. Ancient histories, faded novels, government reports, weather journals. Everything smelled faintly of old paper and cedar. Ranger wandered slowly through the room. His limp remained noticeable, but determination outweighed discomfort. He stopped once more before the same section of oak paneling. The dog stared, then scratched lightly. Once, twice, not frantic, intentional. Ethan walked over. "You don't give up, do you?" His knuckles rapped softly against the oak. Solid. He moved 6 inches to the right. Another knock, a duller sound. He frowned. Perhaps imagination. He knocked again, this time listening instead of merely hearing. Solid, solid, then something different, a faint hollow note hidden beneath thick timber. His expression changed. Ranger looked directly at him. Neither moved. Ethan reached for the nearest lantern. He held it closer to the carved paneling. Years of dust hid intricate woodworking he hadn't noticed before. Small leaves, interwoven branches, one carved acorn slightly darker than the rest. His fingertips brushed across it. Nothing happened. Still, the hollow sound remained. Outside, thunder faded beyond distant peaks. Inside the library, silence settled once more. Ethan looked at Ranger. The German shepherd's ears stood forward, waiting, as though he already knew the house wasn't finished telling its story. Ethan set the lantern on the long oak table and walked back to the paneled wall. Rain still whispered against the windows, but the violence of the storm had passed. The library had become strangely quiet, as if the house itself were listening. He ran his fingertips over the carved oak once more. Leaves, branches, acorns. Every detail had been shaped by hand generations earlier. His thumb paused over the darker acorn. It wasn't worn smooth like the others. Someone had touched it more often. He pressed gently. Nothing. He pressed harder. A faint click echoed somewhere inside the wall. Ranger immediately stood. The dog's ears snapped forward. Ethan slowly stepped back. Nothing happened. No hidden doorway, no shifting stone, only silence. Huh. He pressed again. This time the click came from lower inside the panel. Years of construction work had taught Ethan something valuable. Old mechanisms rarely failed all at once. They simply froze from decades of neglect. He fetched a small pry bar from the truck, along with a can of penetrating oil, and returned to the library. Instead of forcing anything, he carefully examined every seam surrounding the panel. Dust lay evenly across most of the wood, except one narrow vertical line. There the dust looked thinner, as though the panel had once moved. Very carefully, Ethan worked the tip of the pry bar into the seam. Nothing. He tried another corner. Still nothing. Ranger walked closer and placed one paw against the lower section of the panel. His claws scraped softly across the wood. A dull, hollow sound answered from inside. Ethan froze. Not imagination. Definitely hollow. He knelt lower. The lantern's light revealed something almost invisible beneath years of grime. A tiny iron keyhole, hidden within the carving itself. So that's your secret. He smiled for the first time since arriving. The lock had no key, but old locks often shared simple designs. Using a narrow screwdriver from his toolbox, Ethan gently cleared rust and packed dirt from the opening before applying a few drops of oil. He waited. Patience usually solved what force destroyed. 5 minutes later, he inserted the tip again. A careful twist, resistance, then another click. The entire oak panel shifted outward, no more than half an inch. Cold air drifted through the opening, air that hadn't circulated in decades. Ethan slowly pulled. The concealed section swung silently toward him. Behind it lay a narrow stone chamber no larger than a walk-in closet. Ranger stepped forward, but stopped at the threshold. He sniffed once, twice, then looked back at Ethan, as if inviting him to go first. The beam from Ethan's flashlight swept across shelves carved directly into the stone. Dust covered everything, but unlike the library itself, nothing inside appeared disturbed. Wooden document boxes, rolled maps tied with faded leather straps, leather-bound journals stacked neatly one above another, tin cylinders, canvas satchels, an old military footlocker painted dark green. Every item remained exactly where someone had left it. Ethan entered slowly. His flashlight caught tiny particles floating through still air. The room smelled faintly of cedar and dry paper. No mold, no rot. Someone had built this place to preserve whatever it held. He opened the nearest journal. Elegant handwriting filled every page. Dates, names, property boundaries, receipts, observations. The entries stretched back more than 70 years. "This isn't treasure," he murmured. "It's a record." He carefully replaced the journal exactly where he found it. Next came several rolled survey maps. Each carried official county seals, property lines, creeks, old trails no longer marked on modern maps. One map showed nearly twice as much land belonging to the estate as appeared on the deed Ethan had signed. His eyebrows narrowed. That can't be right. Ranger remained unusually still behind him. Not anxious, watching. Ethan reached for the military footlocker. Unlike everything else, it wasn't locked. Inside lay carefully bundled envelopes tied with cloth ribbon. Army correspondence, Veterans Administration paperwork, black and white photographs. Most depicted unfamiliar men standing in front of the manor over several decades. Some wore uniforms, others leaned on crutches. One older photograph showed a group gathered around the very library fireplace where Ethan now stood. Every face looked tired. Every smile looked genuine. He stared longer than expected. What was this place? The answer wasn't there. Not yet. Then his flashlight settled on something hidden against the rear wall. A second door, Unlike the concealed library panel, this one was unmistakable, heavy steel, set directly into stone, nearly 6 feet high. Its surface carried faded olive paint beneath layers of dust. At its center rested an old combination dial, the sort once used on secure government filing vaults. No handle, no hinges visible from outside, only the dial. Above it, someone had mounted a small brass plaque. Property Archive Authorized Access. Ethan stepped closer. The metal felt cold enough to sting. He turned the dial experimentally. It refused to move, completely frozen. No combination written nearby, no instructions, nothing. Whatever lay beyond that door remained sealed. Ranger walked beside him. Instead of scratching, he sniffed the steel once before quietly sitting, as though satisfied. Almost as if this, not the hidden room, had been what he'd wanted Ethan to find. The veteran slowly swept his flashlight across the remaining shelves. There were enough documents here to occupy historians for months. Everything looked organized, intentional, protected. He suddenly remembered Charles Whitaker's letter. Take care of it if you can. If you cannot, at least give it one honest look before deciding. Charles hadn't left him an abandoned mansion. He had left him responsibility. Ethan backed carefully out of the hidden chamber. He closed the oak panel until it clicked softly into place. No one passing through the library would ever suspect anything lay behind it, not until they knew exactly where to look. He stood silently for several moments. Outside, dawn's first pale light began filtering through the rain clouds. Somewhere beyond the mountains, another day had begun. Inside the manor, Ethan looked once more toward the hidden wall. He had come expecting broken roofs and rotten floorboards. Instead, he had inherited a mystery, and somewhere beyond that sealed steel door, someone had believed the truth was worth locking away. Ethan slept little over the next 2 nights, not because of nightmares, because questions had begun replacing them. Each morning he returned to the hidden chamber carrying another journal to the library table. He wore cotton work gloves now, unwilling to damage paper that had survived decades beneath stone. Ranger lay nearby, his bandaged shoulder slowly improving, though every so often he lifted his head towards the front windows before settling again. The journals followed no obvious pattern. Some recorded repairs to the manor, others listed names, dates, families, deliveries that never appeared in county records. Several pages had been written by different hands. One entry simply read, 3 men arrived after sunset. Fed, given dry clothes, left before dawn. No explanation, no destination, just quiet facts. Ethan copied notes into his own notebook, careful not to disturb the originals. Late that afternoon, an engine echoed up the mountain road. Ranger was on his feet before Ethan heard it. The German shepherd walked silently to the front porch instead of barking. His posture changed, alert, focused. Ethan stepped outside. A black luxury SUV climbed slowly through the pines before stopping beside the old stone gate. 3 people climbed out. A man in an expensive field jacket. A younger woman carrying a leather portfolio. Another man wearing polished boots, entirely unsuited for mountain mud. They smiled before reaching the porch. "Too quickly, Mr. Mercer?" the older man asked. "That's me. My name's Douglas Kane." He extended a hand. Ethan shook it once, briefly, no more. "We represent Summit Horizon Development." The company name meant nothing. "We've recently learned you've inherited this property." "I have. We'd like to make an offer." Douglas looked past Ethan toward the manor. A generous one. Ethan remained quiet. Silence often encouraged people to reveal more than questions. The younger woman opened her folder. "Our company plans to develop an environmentally responsible mountain retreat several miles from here." She smiled professionally. "This estate happens to sit in a very important location. It's been sitting here for decades." "Exactly." Douglas laughed politely. "It deserves new life. So does a lot of places." The older man studied Ethan carefully. You've only owned it a short time, that's right. You've probably noticed restoration will cost a fortune. Ethan glanced back at the weathered stone walls. I've noticed. We're prepared to save you the trouble. The woman slid a document across the porch railing. The number printed near the bottom caught Ethan by surprise. It was far more money than anyone should pay for a collapsing manor. He looked up. You've never been inside. Douglas hesitated almost imperceptibly. No. Then how'd you decide what it's worth? The smile returned. Our surveyors evaluated the property. When? Aerial imaging. Ethan folded the paper without signing it. I just got here. No rush. Douglas removed a business card. We're staying in Cedar Pass another week. He looked toward Ranger. Beautiful dog. The German shepherd never wagged. Instead, he stared quietly at the man until Douglas finally looked away. We hope you'll think it over. We'll see. The visitors climbed back into the SUV. Instead of leaving immediately, the driver paused near the gate and spent several seconds looking back toward the manor through the windshield. Only then did the vehicle disappear down the logging road. Ethan watched until the dust settled. Ranger walked to the tire tracks. He sniffed each one carefully before turning toward Ethan. No duh. Ethan shook his head. I don't like it either. The following morning, Ethan drove into the small town for lumber, roofing nails, and fresh bandages for Ranger. The hardware store occupied an old brick building beside the feed mill. Its owner introduced himself as Walt Brennan, a broad-shouldered man in his 70s with hands permanently stained by grease and sawdust. You bought Whitaker Place? Inherited it. Walt chuckled softly. Folks have been calling it abandoned so long they forgot somebody still owned it. He rang up Ethan's supplies before lowering his voice. You have visitors already? Ethan looked up. How'd you know? Black SUV. He nodded toward the window. They stopped here asking directions. What did they want? They didn't say. Walt frowned. But they asked strange questions. Like what? If anybody had been working around the old manor. Ethan said nothing. And whether Mr. Whitaker ever talked about records. That single word caught Ethan's attention. Records? That's what they called them. Walt shrugged. I figured they meant property paperwork. Ethan paid for the supplies. Before leaving, Walt quietly handed him an old county map. You'll find logging trails on there that GPS doesn't know. I appreciate it. Mountain roads have a habit of changing. Outside, Ranger waited beside the truck. As Ethan loaded lumber, the dog suddenly stiffened. His ears pointed toward the far end of the parking lot. A familiar black SUV sat beneath a cottonwood tree. Its windows were tinted. The engine wasn't running. No one appeared inside. Yet it hadn't been there when Ethan entered the store. He pretended not to notice. Instead, he secured the lumber, climbed into the truck, and drove normally through town. Only after turning onto a narrow Forest Service road did he glance into the rearview mirror. 3 minutes later, the SUV appeared, far enough behind to avoid suspicion, close enough to remain visible. Ethan's expression hardened. He had seen surveillance before, not professional, not amateur either. Patient, deliberate. He turned onto another gravel road. The SUV continued. So we're doing this. Ranger remained perfectly still. Ethan never accelerated, never braked suddenly. Instead, he followed the winding road until it split around an abandoned fire lookout. He chose the right fork. At the last possible moment, he noticed in the mirror the SUV hesitate. Its driver chose the left. By the time they realized the roads no longer reconnected for nearly 20 miles. Ethan was already gone. He reached the manor before sunset. The property looked peaceful beneath the evening light, almost welcoming. He parked in his usual position. Before unloading anything, he slowly walked the perimeter. Fresh boot prints crossed the damp soil beneath one library window. Not his, not Walt's, not the veterinarian's. Large, heavy, at least 2 people. Ranger lowered his nose. He followed the tracks until they vanished among the pines. No broken windows, no forced doors, No stolen tools, only evidence that someone had come close enough to study the house. Ethan stood silently beneath the library window. Inside those stone walls rested forgotten journals, old maps, and a sealed steel vault. Outside, someone had begun watching, and whoever they were growing impatient. Ethan crouched beside the boot prints until the last light faded from the meadow. The impressions were deep, heavy men, expensive hiking boots with aggressive tread, almost new. Not the kind worn by ranchers or hunters who knew these mountains. Whoever had come here wasn't exploring. They had arrived with purpose. Ranger moved slowly along the edge of the pine trees, his nose low despite the healing wound on his shoulder. Every few yards he stopped, looked back, continued. Ethan recognized the behavior. Track, pause, confirm, track again. It reminded him of military working dogs searching abandoned compounds years ago. Only this time the mission belonged to one loyal German shepherd. Easy, buddy. Ranger glanced back, but continued following the scent. The trail entered dense timber behind the manor, where decades-old logging roads had almost disappeared beneath moss and young pine. The afternoon remained still, no birds, no wind. That silence bothered Ethan more than noise. Wild places usually spoke. When they suddenly stopped, something had changed. He slowed naturally. His eyes moved ahead instead of down. Branches, tree trunks, ground, ridgeline, then back again. He never walked straight through unfamiliar terrain. Each movement became deliberate. Years in ranger school had burned one lesson deeper than all the others. Slow was smooth. Smooth was fast. About a quarter-mile from the manor, the old scent trail split. One path followed a dry creek, the other climbed toward a rocky ridge. Ranger chose neither. Instead, he stopped. His ears rose. The dog stared toward a narrow gap between two fallen trees. Ethan didn't see anything. Then sunlight caught something thin. A faint metallic line stretched across the trail. Barely visible. Cable. His heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. Tripwire? No. Closer inspection revealed thicker aircraft cable anchored between two saplings, a snare, not for deer, too heavy, too deliberate. Ethan stepped backward. Good catch. He searched the surrounding trees. One anchor point, counterweight, fresh shovel marks. Someone had installed it recently. Before he could move closer, Ranger suddenly lunged. The dog wasn't chasing the cable. He was charging past Ethan. A violent crash exploded from nearby brush. A second cable snapped upward. The hidden trap had been set lower than the first. Ranger intercepted it before it reached Ethan's legs. The steel loop whipped around the dog's chest and shoulder with brutal force. The German shepherd yelped. The sound cut through the forest like a knife. No! Ethan rushed forward. The cable had tightened against Ranger's injured shoulder, reopening the healing wound. Blood spread quickly through golden fur. The counterweight continued pulling. Ethan grabbed the cable with both hands, heavy, far heavier than a hunting snare. Someone had designed it to disable a full-grown man. His knife came free in one cut. Nothing. Steel strands resisted. A second, third. Finally, the cable frayed enough for Ethan to twist it apart. The tension released instantly. Ranger collapsed onto damp pine needles. His breathing came hard. Bright blood stained the forest floor. Ethan dropped beside him. It's okay. His own voice sounded unsteady. It's okay, partner. The dog tried standing. His front leg buckled immediately. Ethan pressed a clean bandage against the wound. Not deep enough to kill, too deep to ignore. Whoever had built the trap hadn't intended to scare trespassers. They had intended to stop them. He carefully lifted Ranger into his arms. 65 pounds had never felt heavier. The walk back to the manor seemed twice as long. Every few steps, Ethan glanced behind him. No movement, no voices, only trees, watching. The veterinarian met him outside before he even reached the clinic door. Again? Ethan nodded once. It wasn't the snake. She peeled back the soaked bandage. Her expression changed. This was wire steel cable. She looked into Ethan's eyes, hesitant. He didn't answer immediately. No. An hour later, Ranger lay sleeping under mild sedation. Fresh stitches crossed his shoulder. The veterinarian removed her gloves slowly. If somebody's setting traps that size, I know. You should report it. I will. She hesitated. You have somewhere to stay tonight? The Manor. She didn't seem comforted by the answer. Darkness had settled by the time Ethan returned. For the first time since inheriting the estate, he locked every exterior door before sunset. He checked every window, every latch, every room, not out of fear, out of discipline. Ranger slept near the fireplace, occasionally twitching as medicine pulled him into deeper sleep. Ethan remained awake. He spread the county map across the library table. The hidden chamber stood open behind him. Journal after journal surrounded the map. His flashlight stopped over one faded entry dated 1978. 3 former servicemen arrived before daylight, allowed to remain until arrangements completed. No names, another page. Widow and 2 children sheltered 3 nights, transferred safely. Transferred where? He turned more pages. The pattern repeated. Families, veterans, short stays, no explanations. The Manor hadn't simply been somebody's home. It had been something else. Somewhere between sanctuary and safe house. A knock echoed through the front door. 3 slow taps. Ethan instinctively extinguished the lantern nearest the window. He waited. Another knock. Different rhythm, not hurried, not threatening. He opened the door cautiously. An elderly woman stood beneath the porch light holding a covered casserole dish. Her pickup truck waited behind her. My name's Helen Brooks. Her silver hair escaped beneath a wool cap. Walt from the hardware store said your dog got hurt. Ethan looked surprised. I made chicken stew. She smiled gently. I figured neither of you had time to cook. He almost refused. Old habits. Don't burden strangers. Then he remembered the empty pantry. Thank you. She glanced toward Ranger sleeping inside. My husband served in Vietnam. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. I learned a long time ago that soldiers are good at helping everyone except themselves. She placed the dish in Ethan's hands. If you need anything. She pointed toward lights glowing faintly across the valley. 3rd Ranch past the bridge. Then she simply left. No questions. No curiosity, only kindness. After her truck disappeared down the mountain road, Ethan stood quietly on the porch. The stew remained warm through the towel wrapped around it. Behind him, Ranger stirred slightly. For years, Ethan had believed the world had forgotten him. Now, complete strangers kept proving him wrong. He carried the meal inside. As he passed the library, Ranger suddenly lifted his head. Despite the pain, despite the medicine. The dog looked directly toward the hidden wall. His ears rose, not because something inside the library moved, because somewhere outside, far beyond the windows, an engine quietly started in the darkness. Ethan didn't move. The stew remained untouched on the kitchen table while Ranger lifted his head from the blanket, his ears fixed toward the valley below the manor. The engine idled for several seconds, then faded. Not toward the county road. Away from it, whoever had been watching the house knew enough not to linger. Ethan quietly drew the curtains over every downstairs window before adding another log to the fire. He wasn't hiding, he simply refused to silhouette himself against the light. Another habit that had survived combat. He slept in short stretches that night, waking every hour without needing a clock. Each time he listened before opening his eyes. Rain, wind, fire, Ranger's breathing. Nothing else. Morning brought clear skies and sharp mountain air. The storm had washed the forest clean. Sunlight glittered on wet pine needles while distant peaks shone beneath fresh snow. Ranger insisted on following Ethan outside despite the stitches. You stay close today. The German shepherd accepted the slower pace without complaint. They spent the morning repairing a section of broken fence near the meadow. The work steadied Ethan's thoughts. Hammer.wire.posts. Simple problems usually had honest solutions. People were harder. Near noon, a dusty county pickup rolled into the driveway. An elderly man stepped out wearing a faded Forest Service jacket with a retired badge still clipped to the pocket. "You Ethan Mercer?" "I am." The man extended a weathered hand. "Name's Owen Callahan." His grip was firm. "Walt said you might appreciate another pair of eyes around this old place." "You work these mountains?" 36 years, he smiled toward Ranger. "And I hear your partner's got a better nose than most deputies." Ranger sniffed the newcomer once before quietly accepting him. That alone meant something. They walked the property together. Owen rarely spoke unless necessary. He noticed things the way experienced woodsmen did. Broken bark, old blaze marks on forgotten trails, water runoff beneath the western slope. When they reached the library window, Owen stopped. "Somebody's been here." Ethan nodded. "You can tell? The moss." He pointed beneath the stone foundation. "It grows evenly unless boots scrape it." Sure enough, several patches had been disturbed. Owen crouched beside one footprint. "Not hunters. Why? Hunters look at the woods." He pointed toward the manor. "These fellows only looked at the house." The old ranger stood again. "I've seen that before." "When?" "People searching for something they already believe exists." The words lingered. Later that afternoon, Ethan drove into Cedar Pass carrying one of the journals wrapped carefully in cloth, not to show everyone, only one person. The county archives occupied the basement of a small stone courthouse. Its director, Sarah Collins, greeted him with reading glasses balanced halfway down her nose. She appeared to be in her early 50s, with gray beginning to streak through dark hair tied neatly behind her head. "You must be Mr. Mercer." "Walt called?" He did. Sarah accepted the journal carefully. "Let's see what you found." She opened the first page beneath a soft reading lamp. Within moments, her expression changed. "This handwriting. You recognize it?" "I recognize the family." She turned another page. "The Whitakers owned timber operations all across this region after the Second World War. I thought Charles lived here alone." "He did, but this," her finger rested on one name, "isn't a business ledger. It was a list. Each line recorded only a surname, a date, a short note. Received, departed, safe." Sarah frowned thoughtfully. "That's unusual." She disappeared into a back room. When she returned, she carried 2 thick county record books. She compared dates, then looked at Ethan. Most of these families vanish from public records for several months, meaning they simply disappear. She tapped at another page, then suddenly reappear somewhere else. Ethan leaned closer. Well, how many? Sarah kept turning pages. More than 50. Another journal produced similar entries, then another. The names stretched across decades. Veterans, widows, children, always arriving quietly, always leaving quietly, never with explanations. Sarah looked toward Ethan. Whatever this manor was, it wasn't just a home. She nodded. "I think someone was protecting people." The realization settled heavily between them. Not charity, organization, purpose. One final document slid from the journal as Sarah closed it, an old folded survey map. She carefully unfolded the brittle paper. The map showed property lines reaching far beyond the current estate. Large sections had been outlined in red ink. Several handwritten notes circled creeks and meadows. At the bottom appeared one sentence: "Transfer never completed. Retain original deeds." Sarah looked up immediately. "Where did you find this?" "In a hidden room." She lowered her voice. "If original deeds still exist, they matter, they could." She turned toward the courthouse shelves. "A lot. There were land disputes here during the 60s and 70s. She hesitated. Several mountain families claimed they lost property through questionable transfers. "Think this connects?" "I don't know. But if the original documents survived..." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Ethan suddenly remembered the heavy steel vault hidden behind the library wall, the combination lock, the words stamped above it. Property Archive. He had assumed it contained ordinary records. Now he wasn't so certain. Sarah carefully returned every journal to its cloth wrapping. "I'd keep these somewhere very safe. I intend to." As Ethan prepared to leave, she stopped him. "One more thing." He turned. "Yesterday, someone came asking whether we kept duplicate property maps." "Who?" "They represented a development company, Summit Horizon. They seemed unusually interested." Outside, Ethan stood beside his truck longer than necessary. The mountains surrounding Cedar Pass looked peaceful beneath the afternoon sun. Yet somewhere among those ridges, someone wanted forgotten records badly enough to watch an old manor, set traps, and search for documents they apparently hadn't found. Ranger quietly rested his head against Ethan's hand. The German shepherd's scarred shoulder had begun healing, but his eyes remained fixed toward the distant mountains. Toward home. Toward the hidden vault that still waited behind its frozen steel door. Whatever lay inside, it was no longer simply a mystery. It had become a mission. Ethan drove back to Black Pine Ridge before sunset, with the journals secured inside a weatherproof case behind the truck seat. Every few miles, he checked his mirrors without thinking. No black SUV appeared. That didn't reassure him. People who wanted something badly rarely made the same mistake twice. The manor came into view beneath a sky already filling with low gray clouds. Fresh snow dusted the highest peaks, and a cold wind swept through the pines carrying the sharp scent of another storm. Winter was arriving early. Ranger climbed out carefully, favoring his healing shoulder, but refusing to remain inside the truck. "You've earned a few days off," Ethan said. The German shepherd answered by walking toward the front porch. Ethan smiled despite himself. "Yeah, I figured." Inside the library, Ethan spread the survey maps across the long table beside the journals. One map from the hidden chamber matched another Sarah had copied from the county archive. They were nearly identical until he reached the southern boundary. The official county version stopped at the creek. The original continued another 2 miles. Entire valleys had vanished from the legal record. He traced the faded ink with one finger. Somebody rewrote history. A gust rattled the windows, then another. Snowflakes began drifting past the glass. Within an hour, the storm had swallowed the mountains. Visibility dropped to little more than the front porch. Ethan stepped outside one last time before dark to secure loose tarps covering lumber stacked near the barn. Ranger suddenly stopped beside the porch. His ears rose, his eyes fixed toward the tree line. Ethan listened. Nothing. Then, very faint, a vehicle door, far down the logging road. He extinguished the porch lantern immediately. Darkness reclaimed the manor. Back inside, he closed every curtain. No lights near the windows. Only the fireplace remained, its glow carefully hidden from outside. Years ago, his platoon had learned never to advertise their position after dark. Tonight, those lessons returned naturally, not dramatically, simply because they worked. He carried one lantern upstairs, then deliberately left it burning in a bedroom overlooking the eastern meadow. Anyone watching from outside would assume he intended to sleep there. Instead, he returned quietly to the library. Ranger followed. The dog settled near the concealed panel behind the bookshelves. Outside, snow thickened. Minutes passed, then the crunch of tires, muted, slow. Someone had reached the manor. Ethan moved to the western window and carefully lifted one corner of the curtain no more than an inch. Headlights remained off. A dark SUV rolled to a stop beneath the trees almost 200 yards from the house. 3 figures climbed out. Heavy winter clothing, flashlights stayed dark. They already knew where they were going. "They've been here before," Ethan whispered. The men spread apart, One circled toward the rear garden, another moved toward the barn, the third headed directly for the library side of the manor. No shouting, no forced rush, disciplined movement, not military, professional enough to concern him. Ranger stood silently, every muscle in the old dog tightened. Ethan rested one hand gently against his neck. Easy, the German shepherd remained perfectly still. A beam of light briefly crossed the outside stone wall beneath the library windows, then disappeared. Someone was inspecting the foundation, looking, searching, not stealing tools, not vandalizing, searching. Another faint metallic sound reached Ethan, a pry bar, working against old stone, his eyes narrowed. They know. The man outside moved closer to the hidden chamber's location with surprising confidence. Too confident. The information had come from somewhere. Ethan quietly crossed the room and lifted the weatherproof case containing the journals. He slipped it into an old storage cupboard beneath the staircase before returning to the library. If someone entered, they would find empty shelves, not the records. Outside, the third man raised a hand. A small flashlight blinked twice toward the trees. Signal acknowledged. 2 more figures emerged from the darkness. 5 now, far more than Ethan expected. He reached into his pocket and removed his phone. 1 bar of signal, barely enough. He dialed the county sheriff's office. Static crackled. The dispatcher answered. "This is Ethan Mercer at Black Pine Ridge Manor." His voice remained calm. "I have multiple trespassers on the property." The line broke, returned. The dispatcher caught enough. "Units. Weather. Delayed. I understand. No panic. Just information. They appear to be searching the house. We're coming." The call ended. Ethan slipped the phone away. He looked at Ranger. "They'll be a while." The dog never looked away from the window. A sudden crash echoed from the rear of the manor. Glass, one of the old basement windows. The intruders had found another way inside. Ethan extinguished the final lantern. The library disappeared into darkness. Only the fire cast faint orange light across the floor. He crouched beside the bookshelves, not preparing for a fight, preparing to observe, to delay, to protect the evidence until help arrived. Footsteps echoed faintly through the basement below. Slow, methodical, searching room by room. Ranger lowered himself beside Ethan without making a sound. Snow continued falling outside. Inside the old manor, 5 strangers moved steadily closer to the hidden library, and behind the sealed steel vault door. The truth they had crossed mountains to erase remained only a few feet away. Ethan listened as footsteps crept through the basement below. 1 pair stopped, another continued. A third scraped slowly across the concrete floor, as though someone was moving heavy equipment instead of searching randomly. "They've got a plan," he whispered. Ranger remained pressed against the bookshelves, his breathing steady despite the fresh stitches beneath his bandage. The old dog looked toward the library door, not frightened, waiting. A beam of white light slipped beneath the gap at the bottom of the hallway door. Someone had reached the first floor. The flashlight disappeared. Came the quiet click of another door opening somewhere near the dining room. They were clearing the manor room by room, methodically. Ethan knew the rhythm. He had seen it before in abandoned compounds overseas. Search. Pause. Communicate. Advance. The difference was that tonight he wasn't hunting anyone. He was protecting evidence. He carefully reached beneath the library table and removed the weatherproof case containing the journals. The case disappeared beneath loose floorboards he had discovered while repairing the room 2 days earlier. It wasn't much of a hiding place, but it would buy time. Ranger shifted slightly. His ears snapped toward the staircase. Footsteps. Closer now. The library door handle moved. Once, twice. The old latch held. A muffled voice whispered from the hallway. Another answered. Metal scraped softly against wood. They're trying to pry it. Ethan looked around the room. No weapons, only books, furniture, firewood. He quietly dragged the heavy reading table several inches, just enough to create a narrow barrier behind the doorway without making enough noise to reveal his exact position. Another push against the door. The hinges groaned, the old oak held. Outside, wind battered the western windows while snow struck the glass in hard bursts. Then, a distant sound drifted through the storm, a siren, faint, very faint. The men outside heard it too. The pressure against the library door stopped instantly. Voices rose briefly in the hallway, urgent. One set of footsteps hurried toward the rear of the manor. Another ran upstairs, not searching anymore, leaving. Within seconds, the house became strangely quiet. Ethan waited. 30 seconds. A full minute. He refused to move too soon. Patience had kept him alive more than once. Finally, Ranger stood. The German shepherd walked to the library door and sniffed beneath it. His posture softened. "They're gone?" Ranger looked back. Ethan slowly opened the door. The hallway stood empty. Fresh boot prints marked the dust. A broken basement window had allowed snow to drift across the stone floor below. The intruders had searched several rooms, but left in a hurry. The hidden chamber remained untouched. They had never found it. Blue and red lights finally flashed through the trees outside. Two sheriff's deputies climbed the porch steps while another vehicle stopped near the gate. Deputy Laura Briggs entered first, removing her snow-covered hat. "Mr. Mercer, I'm here." She swept her flashlight across the room. "You reported trespassers. We're inside." She immediately began examining the hallway. Another deputy inspected the shattered basement window. Outside, tire tracks stretched back toward the logging road before disappearing beneath fresh snow. Deputy Briggs frowned. They knew the weather would erase most of this. They planned ahead. She nodded. "Looks that way." After photographing the damage, she turned toward Ethan. "Anything stolen?" He looked toward the concealed panel. "No. Anything they seemed interested in? The library." She raised an eyebrow. "Books?" "Not exactly." Ethan hesitated, then made a decision. He showed her the hidden chamber. The deputy stood silently inside for nearly a minute, her flashlight passing over the journals, maps, and the sealed steel vault. "I've worked this county 15 years, she said quietly. "I had no idea this existed." "Neither did I." She examined the heavy vault door. "Looks government, that's what I thought. You should keep this confidential." "I intend to." She looked directly at Ethan. "I'll increase patrols, I appreciate it. But," she paused, "whoever came tonight wasn't interested in vandalism. No, they came for something specific." Ethan rested one hand against the cold steel vault. "I think it's behind this door." The deputies left shortly before dawn. Snow continued falling, blanketing the fresh footprints until the meadow looked untouched once more. Nature erased evidence without asking questions. Inside, Ethan sat alone before the sealed vault while Ranger lay beside him, finally asleep after the long night. The old combination dial reflected the first pale light filtering through the library windows. He studied it quietly. Years earlier, he had been trained to breach locked doors, explosives, mechanical tools, forced entry. None of those methods belonged here. Whoever sealed this archive had intended someone to open it the right way, not the fastest way, the right way. As morning settled over Black Pine Ridge, Ethan unfolded one of the old survey maps again. Near its corner, almost hidden beneath a faded fold, he noticed a series of penciled numbers he had overlooked before. 6, 32, 11, 48. His eyes slowly lifted toward the combination dial. For the first time since arriving at the manor, he wondered if the people who had hidden the truth had also left the key to finding it. Ethan carried the survey map to the long library table and studied the penciled numbers beneath brighter morning light. 6, 32, 11, 48. The handwriting matched several notes inside the journals. Careful, deliberate, never hurried. He turned toward the heavy steel vault. The old combination dial was stiff, but no longer frozen after days of careful oiling. He rested one hand on the cold metal. This better be worth all the trouble. Ranger walked over quietly. His shoulder had begun to heal, though a narrow scar now crossed the thick fur where the cable had cut through. The old German shepherd leaned against Ethan's leg, then sat facing the vault as though waiting for permission. Ethan slowly turned the dial. 6, back to 32, forward to 11, then finally 48, nothing. He wasn't surprised. Old combination locks required patience. He reset the dial, tried again, this time moving more slowly, listening instead of forcing. Small clicks answered beneath the steel. One, then another. When the dial reached 48, something shifted deep inside the mechanism. A heavy metallic thud echoed through the stone chamber. Ranger stood immediately. The vault door moved no more than half an inch, but it moved. Ethan stared for several seconds before wrapping both hands around the recessed handle. The hinges protested softly. Dust drifted into the lantern light. The door opened. Inside stood rows of narrow steel shelves, not money, not jewels, not hidden gold. Gray archival boxes filled nearly every shelf, each labeled in neat black lettering. Band records, trust agreements, military correspondence, family claims. At the very center rested a single cedar box. Unlike everything else, it carried Ethan's name, Mercer. His heartbeat slowed. Not from fear, from disbelief. He carefully lifted the box onto the library table. The lid opened without resistance. Inside lay only 3 things: a folded handwritten letter, an old bronze military challenge coin, and a faded photograph. The photograph showed Charles Whitaker standing beside 3 younger veterans on the Manor's front porch sometime in the early 1990s. One of them was Ethan. He barely recognized himself. Straight back, dark hair, eyes that hadn't yet learned how much they would someday lose. Charles stood with one hand resting quietly on his shoulder. No speeches, no ceremony, just quiet companionship. Ethan remembered the day, not because of the photograph, because Charles had spent the afternoon teaching several recovering veterans how to repair broken stone walls around the manor. He had said something Ethan never forgot. A house stays standing because every stone carries part of the weight. At the time, Ethan thought they were talking about masonry. Now he realized they never had been. He unfolded the letter. Mr. Mercer, if you are reading this, then Ranger found what I hoped he would. Yes, the dog. His previous handler and I became friends many years ago. When Ranger entered the rehabilitation program after retirement, I quietly followed his progress. Then I learned who had been paired with him. You. I remembered the young Ranger who never asked for sympathy in the hospital. Only work. Only purpose. The world has a habit of overlooking men after they come home from war. I believed this house deserved someone who understood what it meant to carry invisible burdens. This manor was never valuable because of its stone. It became valuable because of the people who found shelter here after World War II, after Korea, after Vietnam. Families came quietly, veterans came quietly, widows came quietly. No newspapers, no speeches, only safety. The records inside this vault belong to them. Protect them. Not because paper matters, because truth does. The land surrounding this valley was taken through dishonest transfers over many years. Everything needed to correct those wrongs is now in your hands. Do not carry the burden alone. Trust the good people these mountains still have. You will know them when they arrive. And finally, the manor does not need an owner, it needs a guardian. Charles Whitaker Ethan lowered the letter. For several minutes, the only sound in the library came from the fire burning steadily in the restored hearth. Ranger rested his head across Ethan's boot. The veteran rubbed one hand across the dog's neck without speaking. The years seemed to settle around him differently now. Not lighter, but shared. A truck climbed slowly into the driveway outside, not hurried, not hidden. Deputy Laura Briggs stepped onto the porch, accompanied by Sarah Collins, the county archivist, and Attorney Halbrook. When Ethan opened the front door, none of them spoke immediately. They could see something had changed. "The vault opened," Ethan said quietly. Sarah's eyes widened. "It did?" He nodded. "I think you'd better come inside." An hour later, the library table was covered with carefully organized documents: original federal land patents, signed trust agreements, boundary surveys carrying government seals, correspondence between Whitaker and state officials documenting repeated attempts to prevent fraudulent land transfers. Sarah turned one fragile page after another with white cotton gloves. Her voice became almost a whisper. "These are the originals." Attorney Halbrook adjusted his glasses. "If these are authenticated, they'll overturn decades of property disputes," Sarah finished. Deputy Briggs leaned back slowly. "So that's why they broke into the manor." Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. Outside, fresh snow reflected afternoon sunlight across the meadow. Inside the old library, Ethan looked around the room that had once felt abandoned. Now it held 4 people united by something larger than any one of them. Charles had been right. Some burdens were never meant to be carried alone. Ranger quietly crossed the room and lay down before the open vault. His eyes closed almost immediately. For the first time since reaching Black Pine Ridge, the old German shepherd looked completely at peace. Ranger slept through the afternoon without lifting his head. The scar across his shoulder caught the firelight each time he breathed, a quiet reminder of the price he had paid to lead Ethan to the hidden vault. No one disturbed him. Sarah Collins spent hours photographing every document before carefully sealing each one inside archival sleeves. Attorney Halbrook organized the original deeds according to date, while Deputy Briggs recorded every item discovered inside the vault. The library no longer felt abandoned. It felt alive. By sunset, the long oak table held stacks of history that had nearly disappeared forever. Sarah closed the final document with extraordinary care. "I've never seen anything like this." Attorney Halbrook nodded. "Neither have I." He looked toward Ethan. "These records are enough to reopen every fraudulent transfer identified in the journals," Deputy Briggs added quietly. "The state investigators will take over from here." Ethan looked at the shelves surrounding them. "I don't want the papers leaving the manor." Sarah smiled. "They won't." He looked surprised. "The state archive director already called." She folded her gloves. "They're recommending this house become an official historical repository. The records stay where they belong." Ethan rested one hand against the old library table. Charles would have liked that. The investigation spread quietly over the following months. County surveyors returned to forgotten boundary markers buried beneath brush and moss. Original property lines matched the hidden maps almost perfectly. Families whose grandparents had long insisted portions of their ranches had been taken unfairly. Finally received answers no one had believed still existed. Some recovered grazing rights. Others reclaimed timber parcels that had disappeared from public records decades earlier. No headlines called Ethan a hero. He preferred it that way. When reporters occasionally found the long mountain road leading to the manor, they usually left disappointed. The quiet veteran declined interviews. "There are people more important than me in those files." That was all he ever said. Spring slowly reached Black Pine Ridge. Snow retreated from the lower valleys first. Wildflowers returned along the creek. The old orchard behind the manor surprised everyone by blooming after decades of neglect. Ethan repaired porch railings, replaced broken shingles, rebuilt sections of the stone wall Charles had once shown him how to restore. Every repair felt different now, not like survival, like stewardship. Ranger followed him everywhere, His limp became less noticeable with each passing week. Sometimes visitors arrived, a retired Marine passing through the Rockies, a widowed Army nurse who had found one of the names preserved in the journals, a young family whose grandfather had once stayed at the Manor after returning from Vietnam. They drank coffee in the library, read old letters. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they cried. Nobody hurried. The house seemed to understand silence. One Saturday morning, Helen Brooks arrived carrying fresh cinnamon rolls. Behind her came Walt Brennan with lumber balanced across his truck bed. Owen Callahan followed carrying saplings for the damaged windbreak. By noon, half the valley seemed to have found an excuse to stop by. Nobody announced a workday. It simply happened. Fresh paint appeared on porch railings. Broken fence posts disappeared. Children gathered fallen branches into neat piles, while their parents repaired garden beds that had not grown vegetables in years. Watching from the front steps, Ethan felt strangely uncertain. Helen noticed. "You planning to tell all these people to go home?" He smiled. "I was thinking about it." "No, you weren't." She handed him another hammer. "You've finally learned something. What's that? This place doesn't belong to one person." He looked across the meadow. She was right. It never had. Later that summer, the county officially dedicated the manor as the Whitaker Veterans Heritage House. The ceremony remained small. No politicians, no television cameras, just neighbors, veterans, families. Arach unveiled a simple bronze plaque beside the front door. It read, "This house stood because people chose to carry one another." Ethan traced the lettering with his fingertips. Charles had said almost those exact words years before. A house stays standing because every stone carries part of the weight. Now he finally understood. That evening, the visitors slowly drifted home. The mountains settled into their familiar quiet. Sunset painted the granite peaks with deep gold before fading into blue. Inside the library, Ethan returned each journal to its proper shelf inside the restored vault. The heavy steel door remained open now. There was no reason to hide the truth anymore, only to preserve it. He switched off all but one lamp. Ranger rose slowly and crossed the room. Without hesitation, the old German shepherd walked to the same bookshelf that had first captured his attention on the day they arrived. He stood there for a moment, touched the oak gently with his nose, then turned in a slow circle and lay down exactly where he had waited so many nights before. Ethan watched him. "You knew." Ranger closed his eyes. Maybe he had smelled old paper hidden behind stone. Maybe he had noticed a draft no human could detect. Or maybe loyal dogs sometimes found what wounded people needed long before those people were ready to see it. Ethan would never know. He walked to the front window. Outside, darkness settled gently across Black Pine Ridge. The lamp beside the library window cast a warm glow across the porch and into the meadow below. Not bright enough to announce itself. Bright enough for someone searching through the night to know they had reached shelter. Ethan left it burning. He locked the front door, not to keep good people out, only to protect what generations had trusted this house to guard. When he finally turned toward the staircase, the silence no longer felt empty. It sounded like home. And somewhere beyond the pines, another traveler might someday look up through the darkness, see one quiet light shining from an old stone manor, and realize they were no longer alone. Before you go, I'd love to ask you one simple favor. If you believe loyalty still matters, take just a second and leave a 1 in the comments. If you believe everyone deserves a second chance, leave a 2. I'd love to see how many of you are still out there who believe kindness can change a life. And if Ethan and Ranger's journey meant something to you, please subscribe and join us here. Every week, we'll bring you another heartfelt story of courage, hope, loyalty, and the quiet strength that ordinary people carry through extraordinary times. Until our next story, take care of yourself, take care of the people you love, and never underestimate the light that one open door can leave in someone's darkest night.